I watched in horror as two police officers approached my 78-year-old grandfather at the lake where he had been fishing peacefully for over 20 years. His hands shook as he tried to explain that he had done nothing wrong, that this was his morning routine, his sanctuary after losing Grandma. But Corinne Mitchell, our new HOA president, stood behind the officers with her arms crossed and a satisfied smirk on her face. She had finally done it. She had called the police on an elderly man for the crime of fishing in his own neighborhood lake, the same lake that had drawn us to buy our home here 2 decades ago, the same lake where Grandpa found peace every morning as the sun rose over the water. But what Corinne did not know, what none of us knew at that moment, was that her desperate attempt to bully my grandfather would backfire in the most spectacular way possible. 3 minutes after those officers arrived, everything changed. Because sometimes, when you push too hard against innocent people, you discover that they have more power than you ever imagined. My name is David, and this is the story of how my grandfather became the most unlikely hero in our suburban neighborhood war. But to understand what happened, you need to know who my grandfather really was. At 78 years old, Samuel Chen had the gentlest soul you could ever meet. Every morning at dawn, he would walk the 3 blocks from our house to the neighborhood lake with his weathered tackle box in one hand and his favorite fishing rod in the other. His steps were slow but determined, his silver hair catching the first rays of sunlight as he made his way along the quiet sidewalks. The lake was the heart of our community, Willowbrook Estates. It was a beautiful man-made lake surrounded by walking paths and dotted with wooden benches where residents would sit and watch the water. The lake was the reason my parents had chosen this neighborhood 23 years ago when I was just a kid. It was the reason Grandpa and Grandma had decided to move in with us after Grandpa retired from his job as a high school math teacher. For over 20 years, Grandpa had been a fixture at that lake. He knew every family in the neighborhood, every dog that walked the paths, every species of bird that visited the water. Children would run up to him to see what he had caught, and he would patiently explain the different types of fish that lived in our lake. Parents trusted him completely. He was like the neighborhood grandfather to everyone. But fishing was more than just a hobby for Grandpa. After Grandma passed away 2 years ago from cancer, those quiet morning hours by the water became his lifeline. I would watch him from our kitchen window as he walked to the lake each day, and I knew he was not just going fishing. He was going to talk to Grandma. He was going to find the peace that seemed to slip away from him everywhere else. The lake gave him purpose. He would come home with stories about the heron that visited the North Shore or the family of ducks that had built a nest near the reeds. Sometimes he caught fish, sometimes he did not. That was never the point. The point was the quiet, the reflection, the connection to something larger than his grief. Our neighborhood had always been peaceful. We had an HOA, but it was mostly run by a retired couple who focused on keeping the common areas clean and organizing the annual block party. They understood that the lake was meant to be enjoyed by residents. They understood that Grandpa fishing there every morning was part of what made our community special. But then everything changed. The retired couple moved to Florida, and the HOA needed new leadership. That was when Corinne Mitchell stepped forward. She was a woman in her 50s who had moved to our neighborhood just 3 years ago with her husband. She had no children, no pets, and apparently no tolerance for anything that did not fit her vision of perfect suburban order. From the moment Corinne became HOA president, I could sense trouble brewing. She walked through the neighborhood with a clipboard, taking notes about every small imperfection she could find. She sent letters to residents about grass that was half an inch too long, mailboxes that needed repainting, and holiday decorations that stayed up one day past her arbitrary deadlines. but I never imagined she would target Grandpa. How could anyone have a problem with a gentle old man fishing peacefully at dawn when the neighborhood was still asleep? The first confrontation happened on a Tuesday morning in early September. I was getting ready for work when I heard raised voices outside. I looked out my bedroom window and saw Grandpa at the lake, but he was not alone. Karen Mitchell was standing next to him, waving a clipboard in the air. I grabbed my coffee and rushed outside. As I got closer, I could hear Karen's sharp voice cutting through the morning quiet. "Sir, I have explained this to you twice already. You cannot fish in this lake without proper authorization from the homeowners association." Grandpa stood there holding his fishing rod, looking completely bewildered. His tackle box sat open on the ground beside him, with his carefully organized lures and hooks glinting in the morning sun. "Ma'am, I have been fishing here for over 20 years," Grandpa said quietly. "The previous HOA board never had any problem with it. They said the lake was for all residents to enjoy." Karen's voice became sharper. "Well, I am the HOA president now, and I am telling you that recreational fishing is not permitted in common areas without explicit written permission. You are violating Section 12.4 of our community guidelines." I stepped forward. "Excuse me, Karen, what exactly is the problem here?" She turned to face me, her expression stern and unforgiving. "Your grandfather is engaging in unauthorized recreational activities in violation of our HOA regulations. I have asked him to stop, but he refuses to comply." "Can you show me exactly which regulation prohibits fishing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable. Karen flipped through the papers on her clipboard with dramatic flair. "Section 12.4 clearly states that no resident may engage in recreational activities in common areas without prior written approval from the HOA board." "That seems like a very broad interpretation," I said. "Does that mean residents cannot walk their dogs on the paths, cannot sit on the benches, cannot let their children play near the water?" Karen's face flushed red. "Do not try to twist my words. I am talking specifically about fishing, which requires equipment and could potentially damage the ecosystem of our lake." Grandpa looked at me with confusion in his eyes. "David, I do not understand. I have never caused any problems. I always clean up after myself. I follow all the fishing regulations from the state. I only keep fish that are legal size, and I release most of them back into the water." "That is irrelevant," Karen snapped. "The rules are the rules. If you want to fish in this lake, you need to submit a written application to the HOA board and wait for approval. Until then, you need to pack up your equipment and leave." The injustice of the situation made my blood boil. Here was this woman who had lived in our neighborhood for only 3 years, telling my grandfather that he could no longer enjoy the simple pleasure that had sustained him through his grief. "How long does the approval process take?" I asked. "The board meets once per month. Applications must be submitted at least 2 weeks in advance. So the earliest possible approval would be 6 weeks from now, assuming the application is complete and acceptable." 6 weeks. She wanted my grandfather to stop his daily routine, his source of peace and healing, for at least 6 weeks while she and her board decided whether to grant him permission to do something he had been doing peacefully for 2 decades. "This is ridiculous," I said. "My grandfather is not bothering anyone. He fishes at dawn when the neighborhood is asleep. He has never caused any problems or complaints." Karen's expression became cold and threatening. "If you have a problem with our community guidelines, you are welcome to attend the next board meeting and voice your concerns. But until then, Your grandfather will comply with our rules or face escalating enforcement actions." "What kind of enforcement actions?" I asked. "Fines, legal action, and if necessary, involvement of local law enforcement." The threat hung in the air like a dark cloud. Karen had just threatened to call the police on my 78-year-old grandfather for the crime of fishing. "Come on, Grandpa," I said, putting my hand on his shoulder. "Let us go home." As we walked back to the house, Grandpa was quiet. I could see the hurt and confusion in his eyes. For the first time since Grandma died, someone had told him that his morning routine, his source of peace, was not welcome. That evening, I spent hours researching our HOA documents and community guidelines. What I found disturbed me more than I had expected. Karen had been busy since taking over as president, and our quiet neighborhood was about to become a battleground. My research that night revealed a pattern that made my stomach turn. Karen had not just been targeting Grandpa. She had been systematically changing our HOA rules and targeting longtime residents with increasingly arbitrary regulations. I discovered that in the past 6 months, she had sent violation notices to 12 different families. Mrs. Henderson received a fine for her bird feeder, which apparently violated a new rule about attracting wildlife. The Johnson family was cited for having a vegetable garden that was deemed aesthetically inconsistent with community standards. Mr. Rodriguez was fined for parking his work truck in his own driveway overnight. Each violation came with the same threatening language about escalating enforcement actions and potential legal consequences. Each targeted families who had lived in the neighborhood for many years and had never received any complaints under previous HOA leadership. But the most disturbing discovery came when I started looking into the procedural requirements for changing HOA rules. According to our community charter, any changes to the guidelines required notification to all residents at least 30 days in advance, followed by a community vote for major changes. Karen had not notified anyone. She had simply started enforcing rules that she claimed existed, without following any of the proper procedures. When I looked at the actual community guidelines that were established when our neighborhood was built, there was no Section 12.4. There was no prohibition on fishing in the lake. In fact, the original document specifically mentioned the lake as a recreational amenity for all residents. I decided to reach out to some of the other families who had received violation notices. What I learned made me even more angry. Mrs. Henderson told me that Karen had suggested she could make her bird feeder problem go away if she supported some upcoming changes to the neighborhood. Mr. Rodriguez said Karen had hinted that his truck parking violation might be overlooked if he was willing to sign a petition supporting new development in our area. Development. That word stuck in my mind. Why would Karen be interested in development in our established neighborhood? I spent the next day digging deeper, and what I found shocked me. Karen Mitchell was not just a power-hungry HOA president. She was connected to a development company called Pinnacle Properties, which had been quietly purchasing land around our neighborhood for the past 2 years. The connection was not immediately obvious. The company was owned by her brother-in-law, and Karen had worked there as a consultant before moving to our neighborhood. But the pieces started falling into place when I realized that many of the families receiving violation notices owned properties that bordered the lake or had prime locations that would be valuable for development. I decided to consult with a property lawyer to understand our rights and options. The lawyer, Janet Morrison, had experience with HOA disputes and property development conflicts. When I explained our situation, she listened carefully and asked detailed questions about our community's history and legal documents. "This sounds like a classic case of HOA abuse," she said. "But there might be something more significant at play here. You mentioned that your neighborhood was built around a lake. Do you know the history of that property?" I admitted that I did not know much about the lake's history, only that it had been there when our neighborhood was developed in the 1980s. "I would like to research the property records for your area," Janet said. "Sometimes these old developments have easements or other legal protections that current residents are not aware of. If someone is trying to change the character of your neighborhood for development purposes, they might be hoping that residents do not know about their rights." She agreed to look into our situation and get back to me within a few days. But she warned me that in the meantime, Karen would likely escalate her enforcement actions. "People like this HOA president thrive on intimidation," Janet explained. "She is probably hoping that residents will be too scared or too tired to fight back. The key is to document everything and not let her illegal actions go unchallenged." That weekend, Karen proved Janet right. She sent official violation notices to Grandpa, demanding that he pay a $200 fine for repeated violations of community recreational guidelines, and threatening legal action if he continued fishing in the lake. The notice was printed on official HOA letterhead and used legal language designed to intimidate. It demanded payment within 10 days and warned that failure to comply would result in additional fines and potential involvement of law enforcement. When Grandpa read the notice, I saw something in his eyes that broke my heart. For the first time since I had known him, my grandfather looked defeated. This woman was not just taking away his fishing spot. She was taking away his dignity, his peace, and his sense of belonging in the community he had called home for over 20 years. But Karen had no idea what she had just set in motion. Her escalation was about to backfire in ways she could never have imagined. The morning of October 15th started like any other. Grandpa woke up at dawn, made his coffee, and prepared his fishing gear. Despite the violation notice and Karen's threats, he had decided to continue his morning routine. He was not going to let a bully take away the one thing that brought him peace. I supported his decision, but I was worried about what Karen might do next. I had no idea that she was about to escalate the situation in the most outrageous way possible. At 7:30 in the morning, I was getting dressed for work when I heard car doors slamming outside. I looked out my window and felt my heart drop. 2 police cars had pulled up near the lake, and I could see officers walking toward where Grandpa was fishing. I threw on my clothes and ran outside as fast as I could. By the time I reached the lake, a small crowd of neighbors had already gathered. Word travels fast in a suburban neighborhood, especially when police cars show up. "Sir, we received a complaint about unauthorized fishing on private property," one of the officers was saying to Grandpa. "We need to ask you to pack up your equipment and leave the area." Grandpa looked completely bewildered. His hands were shaking as he tried to explain. "Officer, I have been fishing here for over 20 years. This is my neighborhood lake. I live right over there." He pointed toward our house with a trembling finger. Karen Mitchell stood about 20 feet away, watching the scene with satisfaction. She had her clipboard in hand and was speaking quietly to the second officer, showing him what appeared to be official HOA documents. "Sir, I understand your confusion," the first officer said gently. "But we have a complaint from the Homeowners Association saying that you are violating community rules. They have provided documentation showing that fishing is not permitted in this area." I stepped forward, my heart pounding with anger and fear. "Officers, this is my grandfather. He lives here. He is a resident of this community, and he has been fishing in this lake for over 20 years without any problems. The officer turned to me. Are you related to this gentleman? Yes, he is my grandfather. We live in that house right there. This whole situation is completely ridiculous. Karen walked over with her official documents. Officers, I am Karen Mitchell, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. This man has been repeatedly violating our community guidelines despite multiple warnings. He was issued an official violation notice last week, which he has chosen to ignore. She handed the officer a folder full of papers. These are copies of our community guidelines, the violation notices we have sent, and documentation of his repeated noncompliance. The officer reviewed the documents while Grandpa stood there looking confused and humiliated. I could see neighbors watching from their windows and gathering on the sidewalks. This was exactly what Karen wanted, a public humiliation that would serve as a warning to anyone else who might challenge her authority. Ma'am, do you have any documentation showing that this gentleman has permission to fish here? The officer asked me. He does not need special permission, I said. He is a resident. The lake is a community amenity for all residents. She is making up rules that do not exist in our original HOA documents. I pulled out my phone and showed the officer the photos I had taken of our original community guidelines. Look, there is no prohibition on fishing in the lake. In fact, the original documents specifically list the lake as a recreational amenity for residents. The second officer walked over after speaking with Karen. This appears to be a civil matter between the resident and the HOA. We cannot make an arrest based on an HOA rule violation. Karen's face turned red. But he is trespassing on common property after being told to leave by the proper authority. Ma'am, if he is a resident of this community, he has a right to use the common areas, the first officer explained. HOA disputes are civil matters that need to be resolved through proper legal channels, not through law enforcement. The officers began to pack up their papers, clearly ready to leave. But the damage was already done. My grandfather had been questioned like a criminal in front of his neighbors for the simple act of fishing in his own community lake. As the police cars drove away, the gathered neighbors began to disperse, but I could see something different in their faces. Karen's dramatic escalation had backfired. Instead of intimidating the community into submission, she had shown everyone exactly what kind of person she really was. Mrs. Henderson walked over to Grandpa. Samuel, I am so sorry this happened to you. This is absolutely disgraceful. Other neighbors nodded in agreement. Mr. Rodriguez shook his head in disgust. This is not the neighborhood we moved to, he said. Something needs to be done about this woman. But while the neighbors were supportive, I could see that the confrontation had taken a toll on Grandpa. His hands were still shaking, and he looked older and more fragile than I had ever seen him. That afternoon, our doorbell rang. It was Janet Morrison, the property lawyer I had consulted. She had a thick folder of documents in her hands and an expression on her face that I could not quite read. David, I need to speak with you immediately, she said. What I found in the property records is going to change everything. The emergency neighborhood meeting was held in the community center 2 days after the police incident. Word had spread quickly through social media and neighborhood group chats. When I arrived, I was amazed to see that nearly every house in our community was represented. The room was packed with angry residents who had finally reached their breaking point. Mrs. Henderson stood up first. I want everyone to know what happened to Samuel Chen yesterday morning. This sweet man, who has been a part of our community for over 20 years, was humiliated by police officers because Karen Mitchell decided to call them over a fishing dispute. The crowd murmured with disapproval. I could see the anger building in the room. But that is not all, Mrs. Henderson continued. I have been talking to neighbors, and Karen has been targeting many of us with fake violations and made-up rules. She fined me $200 for having a bird feeder. A bird feeder, something I have had in my yard for 15 years without any complaints. One by one, other residents began sharing their stories. The Johnson family talked about being cited for their vegetable garden. Mr. Rodriguez explained how Karen had suggested he could make his truck violation go away if he supported her development plans. The Martinez family had been threatened with fines for having their children's bikes visible in their driveway. Each story revealed the same pattern. Karen was systematically targeting long-time residents with arbitrary rule changes and threatening violations. She was creating an atmosphere of fear and intimidation in what had always been a peaceful, friendly community. Then I stood up to address the room. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. What has been happening in our neighborhood is not just about HOA overreach. It is about corruption and fraud. I explained what I had discovered about Karen's connections to Pinnacle Properties and her systematic targeting of families whose properties would be valuable for development. The room grew quiet as residents realized the scope of what was happening. Karen Mitchell is not just a power-hungry HOA president, I continued. She is working with developers who want to change the character of our entire neighborhood. She has been hoping that we would be too intimidated to fight back. The crowd began to buzz with angry conversation. People were connecting dots, realizing that the violations and harassment were part of a larger plan to drive out long-time residents and clear the way for development. But then Janet Morrison, the property lawyer I had consulted, asked to address the room. What she revealed next left everyone speechless. I have been researching the property records for your neighborhood, Janet began. What I found is extraordinary. Your community sits on what is called a historical easement that dates back to the 1920s. She pulled out a thick folder of legal documents. Before your neighborhood was developed, this land was part of a larger estate that included natural springs and a creek system. When the original landowner sold the property for development in the 1980s, he included specific legal protections for the water features and surrounding areas. Janet spread out copies of the original easement documents on a table where everyone could see them. This easement grants permanent, irrevocable access rights to all residents for recreational use of the lake and surrounding areas. More importantly, it prohibits any development or commercial activity that would alter the natural character of the lake. The room was completely silent as people processed what they were hearing. The value of this easement, based on current property values and development pressures in this area, is approximately $2 million, Janet continued. Karen Mitchell and her development company friends have been trying to eliminate this easement by driving out long-time residents who might know about their rights. The crowd erupted in shocked conversation. People were realizing that Karen had not just been harassing them with fake violations. She had been trying to steal millions of dollars worth of property rights from the entire community. What does this mean for us? Asked Mr. Rodriguez. It means that every rule change Karen has made without proper notification is illegal, Janet explained. It means that every violation notice she has sent is fraudulent. And it means that your fishing rights, your access to the lake, and your protection from development are guaranteed by law. Mrs. Henderson raised her hand. What can we do about this? We can file formal complaints against Karen with the state HOA regulatory board, Janet said. We can demand her immediate resignation, and we can pursue criminal charges for fraud and conspiracy. The energy in the room had completely shifted. What had started as a support meeting for my grandfather had become a community uprising against corruption. I motion that we call for Karen Mitchell's immediate resignation, declared Mrs. Henderson. Seconded, shouted Mr. Rodriguez. The vote was unanimous. Every single person in that room voted to demand Karen's resignation and to pursue legal action against her. But as we were organizing our response, my phone buzzed with a text message from a neighbor who had not been able to attend the meeting. The message made my blood run cold. Karen is at the HOA office right now with boxes and a paper shredder. She is destroying documents. Our fight for justice had just become a race against time. Within 30 minutes of receiving that text message, Janet Morrison was on the phone with a judge requesting an emergency court injunction. The legal system moved faster than I had ever seen it move before, probably because the evidence of fraud and document destruction was so clear and immediate. Your Honor, we have evidence that the defendant is currently destroying HOA records and financial documents that are essential to our case, Janet explained over the phone. We need an immediate court order to preserve all documents and freeze all HOA assets. While Janet worked on the legal side, several neighbors and I rushed to the HOA office. When we arrived, we could see Karen through the window, frantically feeding papers into a large shredder. Her car was parked outside with boxes of documents in the back seat. I called 911 immediately. I need to report document destruction and potential embezzlement at our homeowners association office. The police arrived within minutes, followed shortly by a court officer with the emergency injunction. Karen was forced to stop shredding documents and step away from the boxes of records she had been trying to remove. Ma'am, you are ordered by the court to cease all destruction of documents and to surrender all HOA records immediately, the court officer announced. Karen's face was white with panic. I am the HOA president. I have every right to organize and dispose of outdated paperwork. Not when you are under investigation for fraud and embezzlement, the officer replied. Everything in this office is now considered evidence. The police began photographing the scene and documenting the destroyed documents. The paper shredder was full of what appeared to be financial records and correspondence. Karen's desperate attempt to cover her tracks had only made her situation worse. Over the next few days, Janet and her legal team worked around the clock to build our case. What they discovered in the preserved HOA records was even worse than we had imagined. Karen had not just been making up rules and harassing residents. She had been systematically stealing money from the HOA budget. She had approved payments to Pinnacle Properties for consulting services that were never provided. She had inflated maintenance costs and pocketed the difference. She had even been charging the HOA for her personal expenses, including her car payments and vacation trips. The total amount of embezzlement appears to be over $50,000, Janet told me. Combined with the fraud, conspiracy, and attempted theft of the easement rights, Karen is looking at serious criminal charges. But the legal discovery also revealed the full scope of the development scheme. Pinnacle Properties had been planning to purchase the lake area from the HOA by claiming that the community needed to sell common property to cover maintenance costs. The inflated maintenance costs and stolen HOA funds were designed to create a financial crisis that would force residents to agree to the sale. The plan was sophisticated and would have worked if Karen had not gotten greedy and started targeting longtime residents so aggressively. Her harassment of Grandpa and other families had been the beginning of her downfall. The state HOA regulatory board moved quickly once they received our formal complaints. Within a week, Karen was suspended from her position pending a full investigation. An independent board was appointed to oversee HOA operations while the legal case proceeded. Meanwhile, the easement discovery had attracted attention from environmental groups and historic preservation organizations. The original 1920s easement was recognized as an important example of early conservation planning, and our lake was designated as a community heritage site with permanent protection from development. The first person I told about this designation was Grandpa. He was sitting on his favorite bench by the lake, having returned to his peaceful morning fishing routine as soon as Karen was suspended. "Grandpa, I have some news," I said, sitting down beside him. "The lake is now officially protected forever. No one can ever take away your fishing rights again." He smiled and patted my hand. "I knew this would all work out," he said quietly. "Your grandmother always said that bullies eventually defeat themselves if you just stand up to them long enough." As I watched Grandpa cast his line into the calm water, I realized that Karen's attack on him had been the catalyst that saved our entire community. Her attempt to humiliate and intimidate one gentle old man had exposed a conspiracy that could have destroyed everything we loved about our neighborhood. The legal proceedings moved forward quickly. Karen faced criminal charges for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. Pinnacle Properties was under investigation for their role in the scheme, and our community was finally free from the fear and intimidation that had poisoned our peaceful neighborhood. But the most satisfying part of our victory was yet to come. 6 months later, I stood in a courthouse watching Karen Mitchell receive her sentence. The judge had not been sympathetic to her claims that she was just trying to maintain community standards. "Ms. Mitchell, you systematically defrauded your neighbors, embezzled community funds, and attempted to steal millions of dollars in property rights," the judge said sternly. "Your actions represent a profound betrayal of the trust placed in you by your community." Karen was sentenced to 2 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, plus additional damages. The development company she had conspired with faced heavy fines and was banned from operating in our county. But the real justice came in the transformation of our community. The new HOA board, elected democratically by all residents, implemented transparent governance and open communication. Monthly meetings were held where every resident could voice concerns and participate in decisions. The atmosphere of fear and intimidation that Karen had created was replaced by cooperation and mutual respect. Grandpa became something of a neighborhood celebrity. Children would ask him to teach them about fishing, and he started an informal fishing club that met at the lake every Saturday morning. The local newspaper wrote a feature story about how one man's quiet resistance had exposed corruption and saved a community. The lake area was beautifully restored with new benches, improved walking paths, and educational signs about the local wildlife. A small plaque near Grandpa's favorite fishing spot read, "Willowbrook Community Heritage Lake protected in perpetuity for all residents." Most importantly, Grandpa had his peace back. Every morning, he would walk to the lake with his tackle box and fishing rod, just as he had for over 20 years. But now there was something different in his step. He walked with the confidence of a man who had stood up to a bully and won. One morning, As I watched him from our kitchen window, I saw him talking quietly to someone who was not there. I knew he was telling Grandma about everything that had happened, about how the community had come together, about how justice had prevailed. The lessons from our experience spread beyond our neighborhood. Other communities facing HOA abuse reached out to us for advice and support. Janet Morrison started specializing in HOA fraud cases and helped dozens of other families fight back against corrupt board members. Our story became a reminder that ordinary people have more power than they realize when they stand together against injustice. It showed that bullies and corrupt officials depend on fear and isolation to maintain their control. But when communities unite and fight back with truth and determination, justice will prevail. Today, Grandpa still fishes at the lake every morning. The water is calm, the neighborhood is peaceful, and the rights of all residents are protected forever. Sometimes the smallest acts of resistance lead to the greatest victories. Sometimes standing up for one gentle old man means saving an entire community. And sometimes, justice comes to those who never stop fighting for what is right.